The wind howled through the canyon like a banshee's wail, carrying with it the promise of another brutal winter in the Colorado Territory. High above the tree line, where civilization dared not venture, stood a cabin that seemed carved from the very mountain itself. Its weathered logs bore the scars of 15 winters, each one etched deeper into the wood like wrinkles on an old man's face. Inside, Jacob Thornfield moved with the deliberate precision of a man who had learned that survival depended on routine, on never wasting a motion or a moment. The mountain man's hands, gnarled and scarred from countless encounters with nature's fury, worked methodically as he prepared his evening meal. A rabbit he'd snared that morning hung over the fire, its fat dripping into the flames with a satisfying hiss. The sound was one of the few pleasures he allowed himself in this self-imposed exile. His beard, now more silver than brown, caught the firelight as he turned the spit, and his eyes, once bright with youth and hope, had taken on the cold gray of winter skies. Before we continue with Jacob's story, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. Your support means the world to us, and we love connecting with fellow lovers of Western tales from around the globe. Jacob had not always been alone. Once he'd been a different man entirely, a man with a name that mattered in the valleys below, a man with a wife whose laughter could chase away the darkest storms. But that was before the fever took her, before the creditors came for his ranch, before he discovered that the world below held nothing but pain and betrayal. The mountains had called to him then, promising solitude and peace, and he had answered that call with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for driftwood. The cabin he'd built with his own hands had become both sanctuary and prison. Every log had been cut and shaped during that first terrible winter, when grief had driven him to work until his hands bled and his back screamed in protest. The physical pain had been a welcome distraction from the agony in his chest, the hollow ache where his heart used to be. He'd told himself he was building a home, but in truth he was constructing a tomb for the man he used to be. 15 winters had passed since then, each one blending into the next in an endless cycle of hunting, trapping, and surviving. He'd grown to know every tree, every rock, every game trail within a day's walk of his cabin. The seasons had become his calendar, the migration patterns of elk and deer his only appointments. He spoke to no one save the occasional trader who ventured up the mountain path in summer, and even then their conversations were limited to the exchange of pelts for supplies. The loneliness had crept in slowly at first, like frost forming on a window. He'd welcomed it initially, seeing it as proof that he'd successfully severed all ties with the world that had caused him such pain. But as the years accumulated like snowdrifts, the silence had grown heavier, more oppressive. Sometimes he caught himself talking to his horse, a sturdy mare named Patience, or addressing the ravens that frequented his clearing. More troubling still were the nights when he found himself setting 2 plates at his rough-hewn table, only to remember with a start that he was alone. The storm that began that October evening was unlike any he'd experienced in his 15 years on the mountain. It came from the northwest, bringing with it a cold that seemed to seep into his very bones despite the roaring fire in his hearth. The wind didn't just howl. It screamed, rattling the shutters he'd barred against the night and sending snow through every crack and crevice in the cabin's walls. Even Patience, normally unflappable in her shelter beside the cabin, whinnied nervously as the tempest raged. Jacob had weathered countless storms in his mountain fortress, but this one felt different, charged with an energy that made his skin prickle and his instincts sharpen. He'd learned to trust those instincts over the years. They'd kept him alive when lesser men would have perished. Something was coming, something more than just wind and snow. He could feel it in the way the flames danced in his fireplace, in the way the very air seemed to vibrate with anticipation. As midnight approached, the storm reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the mountain itself. Jacob sat in his chair by the fire, his rifle across his knees, listening to the chaos outside. He'd long ago given up trying to sleep during such tempests. The mountain demanded vigilance, and he'd learned to give it what it required. His coffee had grown cold in his cup, but he barely noticed, his attention focused entirely on the sounds beyond his walls. Then, through the cacophony of wind and snow, he heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins. It was a sound he hadn't heard in 15 years, a sound so foreign to his mountain sanctuary that for a moment he thought he might be dreaming. It was the sound of a human voice calling out in distress, barely audible above the storm's fury. A woman's voice, weak and desperate, crying for help in the darkness. Jacob's first instinct was to ignore it, to convince himself that it was merely the wind playing tricks on his isolated mind. He'd heard phantom voices before, especially during the worst storms, when the loneliness seemed to take on a life of its own. But this voice persisted, growing closer, more distinct, until he could no longer deny its reality. Someone was out there in the storm, someone who would surely die if left to face the mountain's wrath alone. The internal battle that raged within him was fierce and immediate. For 15 years he'd maintained his isolation, had built walls not just of wood and stone, but of habit and determination. To open his door now would be to invite the world back into his carefully constructed sanctuary. Yet even as these thoughts raced through his mind, his body was already moving, his hand reaching for the heavy wooden bar that secured his door. The wind nearly tore the door from its hinges as he opened it, and the cold hit him like a physical blow. Snow swirled around him in blinding sheets, and for a moment he could see nothing but white chaos. Then through the storm he glimpsed a figure stumbling toward his cabin. A woman, her dark cloak whipping around her like the wings of a wounded bird. She was barely upright, each step a monumental effort against the wind that seemed determined to claim her. Without conscious thought, Jacob plunged into the storm. The cold bit through his wool shirt as if it were made of paper, and the wind threatened to knock him from his feet with every step. But he pressed forward, driven by an instinct he'd thought long dead. The instinct to help, to protect, to connect with another human being. When he reached her, she collapsed into his arms, her body trembling with cold and exhaustion. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 30 years to his 45, with dark hair that had escaped its pins to frame a face marked more by sorrow than by age. Her clothes, though well made, were soaked through and offered little protection against the mountain's fury. Her lips were blue with cold, and her eyes, when she managed to open them, held a depth of pain that he recognized all too well. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. I can't go any further." Jacob didn't hesitate. Sweeping her into his arms, he carried her back to the cabin, kicking the door shut behind them and dropping the bar back into place. The sudden silence was deafening after the storm's roar, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the woman's labored breathing. He set her down gently in the chair closest to the hearth, then busied himself building up the fire and fetching blankets from his bed. As warmth began to return to the cabin, Jacob got his first clear look at his unexpected guest. She was beautiful. There was no denying that, but it was a beauty tempered by loss and hardship. Her hands, when she held them out to the fire, bore the calluses of hard work, and her dress, though of good quality, showed signs of long travel and rough treatment. Most telling of all were her eyes, dark brown and filled with a sadness that seemed to echo his own. "Thank you," she said when she could finally speak without her teeth chattering. "I thought I was going to die out there." Jacob nodded curtly, uncomfortable with gratitude and unsure how to respond to another person's presence in his sanctuary. He busied himself preparing hot coffee and warming some of the rabbit stew he'd made earlier, his movements efficient but awkward. It had been so long since he'd had to consider another person's needs that he felt clumsy, uncertain. "What's your name?" she asked as he handed her a steaming cup of coffee. He hesitated, the simple question striking him as oddly profound. It had been years since anyone had asked his name, years since his identity had mattered to another soul. "Jacob," he said finally, his voice rusty from disuse. "Jacob Thornfield." "I'm Sarah," she replied, wrapping her hands around the cup as if it were a lifeline. "Sarah Mitchell. I was traveling to Denver when the storm caught me. My horse threw me and ran off. I've been walking for hours." The story was plausible enough, but Jacob's mountain-honed instincts told him there was more to it than she was revealing. People didn't travel alone through the high country in late October, especially not women in good dresses. There was something she wasn't telling him, some deeper story behind her presence on his mountain. But he'd learned long ago that everyone had secrets, and he was hardly in a position to judge. As the night wore on, and the storm continued to rage outside, Sarah began to thaw, both physically and emotionally. She told him fragments of her story, how she'd been widowed 2 years ago when her husband died in a mining accident, how she'd been trying to make a new life for herself in Denver, how the storm had caught her unprepared. But Jacob sensed the gaps in her narrative, the careful omissions that spoke of pain too deep to share with a stranger. For his part, Jacob found himself drawn into conversation despite his long-cultivated habits of silence. Sarah had a way of asking questions that seemed genuinely interested rather than merely polite, and her presence filled the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She admired his handiwork, the sturdy furniture he'd crafted, the neat organization of his supplies, the obvious skill with which he'd built his mountain home. "You've made a good life here," she said, looking around the cabin with what seemed like genuine appreciation. "It must be peaceful, living so close to God's creation." Jacob almost laughed at that, but caught himself. Peaceful wasn't the word he would have chosen. Isolated, certainly. Lonely, undoubtedly. But peaceful? Peace implied a kind of contentment that had eluded him for 15 years. "It's quiet," he said instead, which was true enough. As the hours passed, Jacob found himself studying Sarah's face in the firelight, noting the way her eyes crinkled slightly when she smiled, the graceful way she moved her hands when she spoke. There was something about her that reminded him of his late wife, though they looked nothing alike. Perhaps it was the way she seemed to fill the space around her with life, the way she made the cabin feel less like a tomb and more like a home. The storm showed no signs of abating as dawn approached, and it became clear that Sarah would not be leaving any time soon. Jacob offered her his bed while he took the floor, but she insisted on making do with blankets by the fire. They settled into an awkward but not unpleasant routine, Jacob tending to his morning chores while Sarah helped where she could, both of them dancing around the strange intimacy of sharing such a small space. It was during the second day of the storm that Jacob began to notice the subtle signs that Sarah's story wasn't entirely truthful. Her hands, while calloused, bore the marks of recent injury, cuts and scrapes that suggested a hasty departure rather than a planned journey. Her dress, though well made, was torn in places that spoke of desperate flight rather than accidental mishap. Most telling of all was the way she sometimes started at unexpected sounds, as if she were listening for pursuit. But Jacob didn't press her for details. He understood the need for secrets, the desire to leave the past buried where it couldn't cause further pain. If Sarah was running from something, that was her business. All that mattered was that she was here now, bringing life and warmth to his mountain sanctuary in ways he hadn't expected. The storm raged for 3 days and 3 nights, trapping them together in the cabin's cozy confines. During that time, Jacob found himself changing in subtle but profound ways. The careful routines he'd maintained for 15 years began to shift to accommodate another person's presence. He found himself cooking more elaborate meals, taking greater care with his appearance, even attempting conversation about topics beyond the immediate necessities of survival. Sarah, for her part, seemed to bloom in the cabin's warmth and safety. The haunted look in her eyes began to fade, replaced by something that might have been hope. She threw herself into helping with the daily tasks, mending his clothes with neat, precise stitches, organizing his supplies with an efficiency that impressed him, even helping him tend to patients when the storm briefly abated enough to venture outside. It was on the 3rd night, as they sat by the fire sharing a bottle of whiskey Jacob had been saving for some undefined special occasion, that Sarah finally told him the truth. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush, as if a dam had burst inside her. She had indeed been widowed 2 years ago, but not by a mining accident. Her husband had been murdered by a man named Caleb Reeves, a wealthy rancher who'd wanted their land and hadn't been willing to take no for an answer. When the law had failed to bring Reeves to justice, his money and influence had bought him protection. Sarah had taken matters into her own hands. She'd shot Reeves dead in the street outside the saloon where he'd been celebrating his acquittal, then fled into the mountains with a posse on her trail. "I'm not sorry I killed him," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "He took everything from me, my husband, my home, my future, but I know what I am now. I'm a murderer, a fugitive. I have no right to bring that burden to your door." Jacob listened to her confession in silence, his face revealing nothing of the turmoil in his heart. He understood her pain, her rage, her desperate need for justice in a world that seemed to offer none. He'd felt those same emotions after his own losses, had contemplated similar actions before choosing exile instead. The difference was that Sarah had found the courage to act, to demand satisfaction for the wrongs done to her. "You planning to turn me in?" she asked when he remained silent. Jacob considered the question seriously. By law, he should report her presence to the authorities, should help bring a confessed killer to justice. But the law had failed Sarah just as it had failed him, and he found he had no loyalty to a system that protected the powerful while abandoning the innocent. More than that, he found he couldn't bear the thought of sending her back to face a rope or a prison cell. "No," he said finally. "Your business is your own." The relief that flooded Sarah's face was so profound that Jacob felt something crack inside his chest, some wall he'd built around his heart beginning to crumble. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm and soft against his calloused palm, and for the first time in 15 years, Jacob felt truly connected to another human being. The storm broke on the fourth morning, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and ice. The sun emerged from behind the clouds like a benediction, turning the white landscape into a field of diamonds. Jacob and Sarah stood together on the cabin's small porch, breathing the crisp, clean air and marveling at the beauty of the mountain morning. "I should go," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. "The longer I stay, the more danger I bring to you." Jacob turned to look at her, this woman who had stumbled into his life like a gift from the storm itself. In 4 days, she had changed everything, had reminded him what it felt like to care about another person, to have someone care about him in return. The thought of watching her walk away, of returning to his solitary existence, filled him with a dread deeper than any he'd felt facing the mountain's dangers. "Where will you go?" he asked. Sarah shrugged, a gesture that tried to convey indifference but failed to hide her fear. "West, maybe. California. Somewhere they'll never think to look for me. Winter's coming," Jacob said, his voice carefully neutral. "Mountain passes will be snowed in soon. You'd never make it through alone." It was true, but it wasn't the real reason he wanted her to stay. The real reason was selfish, desperate. The need of a man who'd been alone too long and had suddenly remembered what it felt like to be alive. But he couldn't say that, couldn't burden her with his loneliness when she had troubles enough of her own. Sarah studied his face, and Jacob had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through his practical concerns to the longing beneath. "Are you asking me to stay?" she said softly. The question hung in the air between them like morning mist, fragile and full of possibility. Jacob felt the weight of 15 years of isolation pressing down on him, the accumulated silence and solitude that had become his identity. To say yes would be to admit that his exile had been a mistake, that he'd wasted years of his life hiding from pain instead of learning to live with it. But looking at Sarah, seeing the hope and fear warring in her dark eyes, Jacob realized that some chances came only once in a lifetime. He'd had his chance at happiness and lost it to forces beyond his control. Now, impossibly, he was being offered another chance, not to reclaim what he'd lost, but to build something new from the ashes of the old. "Yes," he said, the word coming out rougher than he'd intended. "I'm asking you to stay." The smile that spread across Sarah's face was like sunrise after the longest night, bright and warm and full of promise. She stepped closer to him, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender in her hair, could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "Then I'll stay," she said simply. They spent the rest of that day making practical preparations for Sarah's extended residence. Jacob cleared space in his cabin for her belongings, such as they were, and began planning modifications that would make the small space more comfortable for 2 people. Sarah threw herself into the work with an enthusiasm that spoke of genuine relief at having found a safe harbor after so long adrift. But beneath the practical considerations lay deeper currents of emotion and possibility. Jacob found himself hyper-aware of Sarah's presence, the way she hummed softly while working, the graceful economy of her movements, the way she seemed to bring light into corners of the cabin that had been dark for too long. For her part, Sarah seemed to be studying him with equal intensity, as if trying to understand the man who had offered her sanctuary without asking for anything in return. As evening approached, they prepared dinner together, a simple meal of venison and vegetables, but made special by the sharing. They talked as they worked, their conversation ranging from practical matters to deeper subjects. Sarah told him about her life before tragedy struck, her childhood on a farm in Missouri, her courtship and marriage, her dreams of building a family and a future. Jacob found himself sharing memories he'd thought buried forever, stories of his own youth, his time as a rancher, even carefully edited recollections of his late wife. It was during this conversation that Jacob began to understand the true depth of Sarah's courage. She had lost everything: husband, home, identity, Yet she had found the strength not just to survive, but to fight back against those who had wronged her. Her decision to kill Reeves hadn't been born of madness or bloodlust, but of a clear-eyed recognition that sometimes justice had to be taken rather than waited for. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked as they sat by the fire after dinner, the question emerging from his own struggles with choices made and unmade. Sarah considered the question seriously, staring into the flames as if seeking answers there. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I regret that the world is a place where such things happen. But do I regret pulling that trigger? No. Reeves was a cancer, and cancers have to be cut out before they spread." Her words carried a conviction that Jacob envied. He'd spent 15 years second-guessing his own choices, wondering if he'd been a coward for running instead of fighting, for choosing exile over engagement. Sarah had faced a similar crossroads and chosen action over retreat. Consequences be damned. As the night deepened, they found themselves sitting closer together on the rough bench Jacob had built years ago. The conversation gradually shifted from past to future, from what had been lost to what might be found. Sarah spoke tentatively of her hopes for the spring, of ways she might contribute to their mountain life. Jacob found himself making plans he hadn't dared consider in years: improvements to the cabin, expansion of his trapping territory, even the possibility of building a proper barn for patients. It was Sarah who first acknowledged the elephant in the room, the growing attraction between them, the way their hands seemed to find excuses to touch, the way their eyes lingered on each other's faces. "This is complicated," she said, her voice soft but steady. Jacob nodded, understanding the understatement. They were both damaged people, both carrying burdens that couldn't be easily set aside. Sarah was a fugitive from justice. He was a hermit who'd forgotten how to live in the world. Any relationship between them would be built on uncertain ground, shadowed by past losses and present dangers. "Complicated doesn't mean impossible," he said, surprising himself with his boldness. Sarah turned to look at him fully, her dark eyes searching his face. "What are you saying, Jacob?" He took a deep breath, feeling as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff, about to leap into unknown territory. "I'm saying that maybe we've both been alone long enough. Maybe it's time to try something different." The kiss that followed was tentative at first, a question asked and answered without words. But as Sarah's arms came up around his neck and her body pressed against his, the kiss deepened, becoming a declaration of intent, a promise of possibilities yet to be explored. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their faces flushed with more than just the fire's warmth. Jacob felt as if he were waking up after a long sleep, as if the world had suddenly become more vivid, more real. Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I haven't felt this way in so long," she whispered, her hand coming up to cup his cheek. "I'd forgotten what it was like to hope." Jacob covered her hand with his own, marveling at the softness of her skin, the warmth of her touch. "Neither had I," he admitted. "I thought that part of my life was over." They talked long into the night, sharing dreams and fears, making tentative plans for a future neither had dared imagine just days before. The storm that had brought Sarah to his door had passed, but Jacob realized it had left behind something precious: the possibility of love, of connection, of a life shared, rather than endured in solitude. As dawn approached, they finally acknowledged the practical reality of their situation. Sarah would indeed stay through the winter. The mountain passes were already becoming treacherous and travel would be impossible within weeks. But what had begun as necessity was transforming into choice, a conscious decision to build something together from the ruins of their separate pasts. The weeks that followed were a time of adjustment and discovery. Jacob found himself relearning skills he'd thought lost forever: how to consider another person's needs, how to share space and decisions, how to open his heart to the possibility of loss again. Sarah proved to be an ideal partner for mountain life, bringing skills and perspectives that complemented his own. She was an excellent shot, a skilled seamstress, and a natural healer who knew which plants could cure and which could kill. More importantly, she brought laughter back into Jacob's life. Her sense of humor, dry and occasionally wicked, could lighten even the darkest winter days. She had a gift for finding joy in small things: the way snow crystals caught the morning light, the satisfaction of a well-cooked meal, the simple pleasure of conversation by the fire. Under her influence, Jacob began to see his mountain sanctuary not as a prison, but as a paradise, a place where two people could build a life free from the complications and corruptions of the world below. The physical relationship between them developed slowly, carefully, with the patience of people who had learned that good things were worth waiting for. When they finally came together fully, it was with a passion tempered by tenderness, a recognition that what they were building was precious and fragile and worth protecting. Winter settled over the mountain like a familiar blanket, but for the first time in 15 years, Jacob welcomed its arrival. The snow that had once been a symbol of his isolation now became a protective barrier, sealing them away from the world in their own private Eden. They developed routines and rituals that spoke of permanence. Morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, evening conversations that ranged from practical to philosophical, nights spent in each other's arms planning for a future that seemed suddenly bright with possibility. It was during one of these conversations, as February snow swirled outside their windows, that Sarah brought up the subject they'd both been avoiding. "What happens in the spring?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Jacob had been dreading this question, knowing it would come eventually. Spring would bring melting snow and open passes, but it would also bring the possibility of pursuit, of discovery, of the outside world intruding on their carefully constructed paradise. Sarah was still a wanted woman, still a fugitive from a justice system that might not understand or forgive her actions. "We'll face whatever comes," he said, pulling her closer against his side. Together. It was a promise he meant with every fiber of his being. Whatever challenges the future might bring, he would not face them alone, and neither would she. They had found something precious in their mountain sanctuary. Not just love, but redemption, the chance to build new lives from the ashes of the old. As spring approached, and the first tentative signs of thaw appeared, Jacob and Sarah began making concrete plans for their future. They would stay on the mountain, at least for now, building a life that was both practical and fulfilling. Jacob would continue his trapping and hunting, while Sarah would tend a garden and perhaps raise some chickens. They talked of expanding the cabin, of building proper outbuildings, of creating a homestead that could sustain them through whatever trials might come. But more than that, they talked of building a family. Sarah was still young enough to bear children, and the thought of little ones running through their mountain clearing filled them both with a joy neither had expected to feel again. It would be a risk. Children would make them more vulnerable, more tied to their mountain sanctuary, but it was a risk they were willing to take. The first real test of their resolve came in early March, when a lone rider appeared on the mountain trail. Jacob spotted him first, a distant figure making his way slowly up the treacherous path toward their cabin. For a moment, both he and Sarah froze, wondering if their past had finally caught up with them. But the rider proved to be nothing more threatening than a traveling preacher, a circuit minister who made his rounds through the remote settlements of the high country. He was a kindly man named Reverend Morrison, weathered by years of mountain travel, but still possessed of a gentle spirit and a ready smile. "I don't suppose you folks would have room for a weary traveler?" he asked, as Jacob met him at the edge of their clearing, rifle in hand, but not raised in threat. Jacob glanced back at the cabin where Sarah stood in the doorway, her face pale but determined. They had discussed this possibility, had agreed that they couldn't live in complete isolation forever. Sometimes the world would intrude, and they would have to decide how to respond. "We've got coffee and a warm fire," Jacob said, lowering his rifle. "You're welcome to both." Reverend Morrison proved to be excellent company, full of news from the outside world and stories from his travels. He spoke of settlements growing into towns, of the railroad pushing ever westward, of the slow but steady march of civilization into the wilderness. But he also spoke of simpler things, of families he'd married, children he'd baptized, communities he'd helped build from nothing more than hope and determination. It was during dinner that the Reverend made an observation that would change everything. "You two have the look of folks who found something special up here," he said, his eyes twinkling with gentle humor. "Reminds me of other couples I've met in these mountains. People who've come here looking for a fresh start and found more than they bargained for." Sarah and Jacob exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. Here was an opportunity they hadn't expected, a chance to make their union official in the eyes of God and man. It was a risk. Marriage would create a legal record, a trail that might be followed, but it was also a declaration of faith in their future together. "Reverend," Jacob said slowly, "would you be willing to perform a marriage ceremony?" The old preacher's face lit up with genuine joy. "Son, there's nothing I'd like better. I've married folks in stranger places than this, and I've never seen two people who looked more ready to take that step." The ceremony took place the next morning, with patience serving as witness and the mountain peaks as cathedral. It was simple and beautiful, an exchange of vows that spoke not just of love, but of commitment, of two people choosing to face whatever the future might bring as partners, rather than individuals. As Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. For 15 years he'd been a man without connections, without ties to anything beyond his own survival. Now he was part of something larger, something that gave meaning to his existence beyond mere endurance. Sarah's kiss sealed their union with a passion that spoke of joy and relief and hope for the future. When they broke apart, both were crying, tears of happiness that had been too long in coming. Reverend Morrison stayed for 2 more days, sharing meals and conversation and blessing their union with his presence. When he finally departed, he carried with him their promise to visit the settlement in the valley below when spring was fully established. It was a small step toward rejoining the world, but an important one. As the snow continued to melt and the mountain began its annual transformation from winter white to spring green, Jacob and Sarah settled into their new life as husband and wife. The legal ceremony had changed nothing fundamental between them, but it had given their relationship a solidity, a sense of permanence that both found deeply satisfying. They worked together to prepare for the growing season, clearing ground for Sarah's garden and making repairs to the cabin that winter had made necessary. Jacob found himself taking new pride in his mountain home, seeing it through Sarah's eyes as a place of beauty and possibility, rather than mere refuge. The garden Sarah planted that spring was a thing of wonder, a riot of vegetables and herbs and flowers that transformed their clearing into something approaching paradise. She had a gift for growing things, the understanding of soil and season that produced abundance from what had seemed like barren ground. Jacob marveled at her skill, at the way she could coax life from the earth with nothing more than patience and care. As summer approached, they received their first visitors since Reverend Morrison's departure. A family of settlers, traveling west to seek their fortune in California, stopped to rest and resupply. They were good people, hard-working and honest, and their children brought laughter and energy to the mountain clearing. It was during this visit that Jacob and Sarah learned news that would change their perspective on the outside world. Caleb Reeves, the man Sarah had killed, had been posthumously exposed as the leader of a criminal organization that had terrorized the territory for years. Evidence had come to light of murders, thefts, and corruption that painted him as a monster rather than a respectable rancher. Sarah's action, far from being seen as murder, was now viewed by many as a public service. "There's talk of a pardon," the settler told them over dinner. "Governor's been reviewing cases where folks took justice into their own hands against Reeves and his gang. Word is, he's inclined to be merciful to those who stood up when the law couldn't." The news filled Sarah with a hope she'd barely dared to feel. The possibility of a pardon would mean freedom to travel, to visit civilization without fear of arrest. It would mean that their children, when they came, would not be born to a fugitive mother. But even as they celebrated this unexpected development, both Jacob and Sarah realized that their mountain sanctuary had become more than just a hiding place. It had become home in the truest sense of the word, a place where they had built something beautiful and lasting from the ruins of their former lives. As autumn painted the mountain in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah discovered she was carrying their first child. The news filled them both with a joy so profound, it seemed to transform the very air around them. After so much loss, so much pain, they were being given the chance to create new life, to build a family that would carry their love into the future. Jacob threw himself into preparations for the baby's arrival with an enthusiasm that surprised even him. He expanded the cabin, adding a room that would serve as a nursery, and began crafting furniture with a care and attention to detail that spoke of deep love. Sarah, despite the discomforts of pregnancy, bloomed like a flower in spring, her face radiant with the joy of impending motherhood. The baby was born on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Sarah had first appeared at Jacob's door. It was a difficult birth, made more challenging by their isolation, but Sarah proved as strong in labor as she had been in everything else. When their son finally arrived, red-faced and squalling with indignation at his sudden entry into the world. Both parents wept with relief and joy. They named him Thomas after Jacob's father, and from the moment he drew his first breath, he became the center of their universe. Jacob, who had thought himself too old and too damaged to be a father, discovered reserves of tenderness and protectiveness he hadn't known he possessed. Sarah, despite her own difficult past, proved to be a natural mother, intuitive and loving and endlessly patient. As winter settled over the mountain once again, the small family huddled together in their cabin, creating warmth and light against the darkness outside. The baby's cries and laughter filled spaces that had been silent for too long, and his presence seemed to bless their mountain sanctuary with a joy that was both profound and simple. It was during this winter that the official pardon arrived, brought by a territorial marshal who had made the dangerous journey up the mountain specifically to deliver it. Sarah was officially cleared of all charges related to Caleb Reeves's death, her actions deemed justified in light of the evidence that had come to light about his criminal activities. The marshal, a decent man named Patterson, stayed for several days, sharing news from the outside world and marveling at the life Jacob and Sarah had built on their mountain. "You folks have something special here," he said as he prepared to leave. "Don't let the world below convince you otherwise." His words proved prophetic. As spring returned and the mountain passes reopened, Jacob and Sarah found themselves facing a choice they hadn't expected. With the pardon in hand, they were free to return to civilization, to reclaim their place in the world below. Friends and relatives, learning of their whereabouts, sent letters urging them to come down from their mountain exile and rejoin society. But as they stood on their cabin's porch, watching their son take his first tentative steps in the mountain meadow, both Jacob and Sarah realized that they had already found what they were looking for. The mountain had given them more than just refuge. It had given them each other, had given them a love that was both passionate and enduring, had given them a family that was their greatest treasure. "What do you think?" Sarah asked, bouncing Thomas on her hip as he gurgled happily at the butterflies dancing among her flowers. Jacob looked out over the vista that had been his home for 16 years, seeing it now not through the eyes of an exile, but through the eyes of a man who had found his place in the world. The peaks still rose majestically toward the sky. The forests still whispered their ancient secrets, but now they were backdrop to something infinitely more precious. A family, a love, a life built from hope rather than despair. "I think," he said, pulling his wife and son close, "that we're already home." The decision to stay was unanimous and immediate. They would remain on their mountain, raising their family in the clean air and honest simplicity of the high country. They would welcome visitors when they came, would maintain connections to the world below, but they would not abandon the sanctuary that had given them everything they'd ever truly wanted. As the years passed, their family grew. 2 more children followed Thomas, a daughter they named Grace, and another son they called Samuel. The cabin expanded to accommodate their growing brood, becoming a true homestead that was both practical and beautiful. Jacob's trapping and hunting provided for their material needs, while Sarah's garden and her skill with herbs and healing made them largely self-sufficient. The children grew up wild and free, as comfortable in the wilderness as their parents had once been uncomfortable in civilization. They learned to track and hunt from their father, to grow and heal from their mother, to find joy and wonder in the natural world that surrounded them. They were mountain children in the truest sense, shaped by the peaks and forests and seasons that defined their world. Visitors came and went, traders and travelers, settlers and soldiers, even the occasional tourist drawn by tales of the hermit who had found love in the wilderness. All were welcomed with the hospitality that had become a hallmark of the Thornfield household, and many left with stories of their own about the family that had built paradise in the mountains. Jacob often reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. On the way, a single storm had changed everything. He had come to the mountain as a broken man, seeking only escape from a world that had caused him too much pain. But the mountain had given him more than refuge. It had given him redemption, had shown him that love could bloom even in the most unlikely places. Sarah, for her part, never regretted the choices that had led her to Jacob's door. The pain of her first marriage's tragic end would always be with her, but it had been transformed from a source of bitterness into a reminder of love's preciousness. She had learned that sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as the greatest trials, that sometimes you had to lose everything to find what you really needed. As they sat together on their porch one evening, watching their children play in the meadow while the sun set behind the peaks, Jacob took Sarah's hand in his. 16 years had passed since that storm-tossed night when she had appeared at his door, and their love had only grown stronger with time. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't knocked on my door that night?" he asked. Sarah smiled, the expression lighting up her face in the way that still made his heart skip a beat. "No," she said simply, "because I know exactly what would have happened. I would have died out there in the storm, and you would have lived the rest of your life alone. We both would have missed the greatest gift either of us ever received." Jacob nodded, understanding the truth of her words. The storm that had brought them together had been more than just weather. It had been destiny, fate, the universe conspiring to bring two broken souls together so they could heal each other. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, their children came running up to the porch, breathless with excitement about some adventure they'd had in the woods. Jacob and Sarah gathered them close, feeling the warmth of their small bodies, breathing in the sweet scent of their hair, marveling once again at the miracle of their existence. The mountain man who had spent 15 winters alone was alone no more. He had found his family, his purpose, his peace. And as the night settled over their mountain sanctuary, filled with the sounds of love and laughter and life, Jacob Thornfield knew that he was exactly where he belonged. The wind still howled through the canyon on winter nights, but now it sang a different song, not of loneliness and loss, but of love found and lives redeemed. The mountain that had once been his prison had become his paradise, and the woman who had begged to stay the night had stayed forever, bringing with her the greatest gift of all, the chance to love and be loved in return. In the end, that was all any man could ask for, and more than most ever received. Jacob had been given a second chance at happiness, and he had seized it with both hands, building from it a life that was rich and full and blessed beyond measure. The mountain man was alone no more, and never would be again.